The Atlantic Ocean in the early 1940s remained largely indifferent to the war unfolding around it. Its surface stretched without visible boundary, shaped by prevailing winds and slow-moving currents that had existed long before modern navigation. In the central Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from any permanent landmass, the water formed long rolling swells rather than breaking waves. The sky often appeared empty, interrupted only by passing cloud systems moving west to east. This region lay along major shipping routes connecting North America, Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Merchant vessels crossed it continuously, carrying fuel, food, and raw materials essential to wartime economies. Despite this traffic, long distances separated one ship from another. A person cast into the water here could drift for days without seeing anything mechanical or human. Sea temperatures varied with latitude and season, but in much of the Atlantic they were survivable for limited periods. Exposure, dehydration, and sun were more persistent threats than cold. Rain came unpredictably, sometimes heavy, sometimes absent for weeks. The sun rose and set without regard for circumstance. In 1942, the ocean was not only a geographic space but a contested one. Submarines moved beneath the surface unseen. Aircraft passed overhead, rarely stopping. Between these layers, the water remained unchanged in appearance. It did not signal danger. It did not offer safety. It simply continued, uninterrupted, in all directions. Poon Lim was born in 1918 on the island of Hainan, off the southern coast of China. The region was largely rural, with fishing and small-scale trade shaping daily life. His early years were marked by limited economic opportunity and by the broader instability affecting China in the early 20th century. Like many young men of his generation, he sought work beyond his immediate surroundings. In his late teens, Lim left China for Hong Kong, where he found employment as a cabin boy in the merchant marine. The work was physically demanding and repetitive, but it offered regular pay and a measure of security. Over time, he learned basic seamanship, shipboard discipline, and the routines of life at sea. He became familiar with long voyages, confined spaces, and the necessity of following orders without question. When the Second World War expanded into East Asia, Lim's situation changed. Japanese forces occupied large portions of China and Hong Kong, disrupting civilian life and maritime employment. Lim left the region and eventually reached the United Kingdom. There, he joined the British Merchant Navy, which was actively recruiting sailors to maintain supply lines across the Atlantic and beyond. By 1942, the Merchant Navy faced severe losses. German U-boats targeted cargo ships with increasing effectiveness, especially in the Atlantic. Sailors were aware of the risks, though specific details were rarely shared. Survival training was minimal. Most merchant seamen relied on basic lifeboat drills and general instructions about emergency equipment. Lim served primarily as a second steward. His responsibilities included maintaining crew quarters and assisting with food service. He was not assigned to navigation or engineering, and he held no command authority. His position placed him below deck for much of the voyage, removed from direct observation of the sea. In November 1942, Lim was assigned to the SS Benlamond, a British merchant vessel built in 1940. The ship was traveling alone, without escort, carrying a general cargo from Cape Town toward Paramaribo in Dutch Guiana. Solo crossings were common due to limited naval protection and scheduling pressures. Lim did not have advanced survival training, nor did he carry specialized equipment. What he had was experience with monotony, fatigue, and obedience to routine. These qualities, developed through years of merchant service, would later shape how he responded to circumstances for which there was no established procedure. On the morning of November 23, 1942, the SS Benlamond was moving steadily through the central Atlantic Ocean. The weather was clear. Visibility was good. There were no immediate signs of nearby vessels. The ship was unescorted, as many merchant ships were at that stage of the war. Shortly before noon, without warning, a German U-boat surfaced within firing range. The submarine was U-172, operating as part of the broader Atlantic campaign against Allied shipping. There was no prolonged engagement. The Ben Lomond was struck by a single torpedo. The explosion occurred on the port side. It caused immediate structural damage and a rapid influx of water. The ship began to list heavily. Power was lost almost at once. There was no time to transmit a distress signal. Crew members who were below deck were killed instantly or trapped. Others were thrown into the water by the force of the blast. The Ben Lomond sank within approximately 2 minutes. Lifeboats could not be launched in an organized manner. Debris surfaced briefly and then dispersed. The submarine did not remain in the area. Poon Lim had been inside the ship at the time of the explosion. He was thrown clear and surfaced amid wreckage. He did not see other surviving crew members nearby. The sea around him contained floating items from the ship, pieces of wood, oil, and scattered equipment. Among the debris was a Carly float, a type of inflatable life raft designed to remain afloat even if damaged. Lim reached it and pulled himself aboard. The raft carried basic emergency supplies intended for short-term use. These included water tins, some food rations, a torch, flares, and fishing equipment. Within minutes, the Ben Lomond was gone. There was no visible land. No ships were in sight. The event that separated Lim from structured maritime life was complete. From that point forward, he was alone on the ocean, without a clear expectation of rescue. The Carly float measured a little over 2 meters in length. It had a rigid outer ring filled with buoyant material and a netted floor suspended across the center. It was designed to keep survivors out of the water rather than provide comfort. There were no sides high enough to block wind or spray. Exposure was constant. The emergency supplies aboard the raft were limited but functional. There were several tins of fresh water, a small quantity of hard biscuits, pemmican, sugar cubes, chocolate, flares, a torch, a knife, and basic fishing gear consisting of line, hooks, and a small spear-like implement. There was no sail, no radio, and no means of propulsion beyond drifting. In the first days after the sinking, Lim followed the rations exactly as instructed. He consumed small amounts of food and water at regular intervals. He expected rescue within days, as was common in some Atlantic sinkings. Aircraft occasionally flew overhead, and shipping lanes were known to cross the region. He conserved energy and avoided unnecessary movement. By the end of the first week, no rescue had occurred. The remaining water tins were still sealed, but the quantity was clearly insufficient for long-term survival. Lim adjusted his intake, reducing water consumption below recommended levels. Dehydration became a controlled condition rather than an emergency. He avoided exposure during the hottest part of the day by lying flat and minimizing movement. Rain became the first sustainable water source. When showers passed over the raft, Lim used available containers and fabric to collect runoff. He improvised additional collection surfaces using parts of the raft and items from the supply kit. Rainfall was inconsistent. Some weeks brought frequent showers, others brought none. Food became the central challenge. Once the rations were consumed, Lim relied entirely on fishing. He adapted the provided fishing line and hooks, learning through trial which depths and methods produced results. Small fish were the most common catch. He ate some raw to conserve fuel, as there was no means of cooking. Others he dried in the sun by spreading them across the raft's surface. Larger fish were more difficult to secure. Lim used the spear to strike when fish swam close enough to the raft. Success was rare but significant. Larger catches provided not only meat but internal organs that contained additional moisture. Nothing edible was discarded. Sharks appeared intermittently. They were drawn by fish remains and by the presence of the raft itself. Lim observed their behavior over time. He learned that sudden movements increased attention. When sharks approached closely, he remained still. On several occasions, he successfully killed smaller sharks using the spear. The meat was consumed. The liver, high in nutrients and oils, became an important food source. Exposure remained constant. Lim had no clothing beyond what he was wearing at the time of the sinking. Saltwater caused skin breakdown. Sun exposure led to burns. At night, temperatures dropped sharply. He repositioned himself continuously to avoid prolonged contact with the netting, which caused pressure sores. The raft accumulated damage over time. The net loosened. The outer ring degraded under constant sun. Lim performed basic maintenance using the knife and available materials, reinforcing weak points where possible. There was no way to replace the raft if it failed. Preservation of flotation was a daily priority. Time lost conventional structure. Lim tracked days by marking the raft with notches. He observed the sun's path and the stars when visibility allowed. Currents carried the raft westward, though the movement was not immediately apparent. There was no control over direction. He adjusted psychologically to the absence of destination. Mental discipline became as important as physical adaptation. Lim avoided extended periods of inactivity that led to despair. He established routines, fishing at specific times, checking the raft's integrity, collecting rain, resting during peak sun. These activities imposed order on an environment that offered none. Several ships passed within visible distance during the months on the raft. Lim attempted to signal using flares and improvised signals. In some cases, the ships did not alter course. In at least one instance, a ship approached but then departed without taking him aboard. Historical accounts suggest racial discrimination may have played a role, though this cannot be confirmed with certainty. Each failed encounter altered Lim's expectations. Rescue shifted from assumption to possibility, and then to uncertainty. He continued signaling when opportunities arose, but survival no longer depended on immediate discovery. It depended on maintaining physical function over time. Illness developed gradually. Salt sores became infected. Vision was affected by prolonged glare. Weight loss was severe. Despite this, Lim retained mobility and coordination. His diet, though minimal, provided enough protein and nutrients to prevent complete physical collapse. The ocean environment remained stable but unforgiving. Storms occasionally passed over the raft, bringing both danger and opportunity. Heavy seas threatened to overturn the float, but storms also delivered rain and sometimes fish. Lim secured himself during rough conditions and waited for calmer periods before resuming activity. After several months, Lim's expectations of duration changed again. Survival was no longer measured in days or weeks, but in maintenance of systems, water acquisition, food procurement, raft integrity, and mental stability. Each day became a repetition of tasks rather than a step toward a known endpoint. The raft continued drifting westward, carried by the south equatorial current. Lim had no precise knowledge of his location, but he observed changes in bird activity and debris density, suggesting proximity to land or shipping routes. These observations did not produce immediate outcomes, but they reinforced the possibility of eventual contact. By the fourth month, Lim had been alone on the ocean longer than most documented lifeboat survivors of the war. His survival was not the result of extraordinary strength or dramatic intervention. It was the accumulation of small decisions repeated consistently under constraint. Physical decline became increasingly apparent as time extended beyond initial expectations. Lim's weight continued to drop. Muscle mass decreased. Movements required more effort, and recovery from exertion took longer. His skin showed signs of prolonged exposure, with areas of infection that healed slowly, if at all. Salt sores along his legs and back worsened due to constant contact with the netting and residual seawater. He adjusted his position frequently to reduce pressure, but complete relief was impossible. Vision problems intensified. likely caused by glare, dehydration, and nutritional deficiency. He compensated by limiting time spent scanning the horizon and relying more on routine observation. Psychological pressure increased, though there is limited direct record of Lim's internal state. What is documented is his continued adherence to structure. Even as strength declined, he maintained his routines. Fishing continued daily. Raft inspections continued. Rainwater collection remained methodical. Encounters with passing vessels became more infrequent as the raft drifted away from major shipping lanes. When ships did appear, the distance was often too great for effective signaling. Flares were finite. Each use reduced future options. Lim reserved them for situations where a ship's proximity justified the cost. One documented encounter involved a vessel that observed the raft but did not stop. The reasons remain uncertain. There is no record of communication, only that the ship departed without rescue. This event marked a psychological turning point. From that point forward, Lim no longer assumed that visibility guaranteed assistance. Time perception altered. Days blurred together. Lim continued marking time, but the markings became less significant than the maintenance of physical function. Survival was no longer framed as waiting for rescue, but as extending viability. Storm exposure increased risk. Heavy seas strained the raft's structure. On more than one occasion, waves partially submerged the netting, increasing salt exposure and fatigue. Lim secured himself as best he could and waited for conditions to stabilize. Each storm left the raft slightly more degraded. Despite these pressures, complete collapse did not occur. Lim's ability to secure food, though inconsistent, continued. Rainfall, while unpredictable, occurred often enough to prevent fatal dehydration. The balance remained narrow but functional. As the raft drifted closer to the western Atlantic, water temperature and marine activity changed subtly. Bird sightings increased. Floating vegetation appeared more frequently. These signs indicated proximity to land, though Lim had no means of navigation to confirm this. By the end of the 5th month, Lim had exceeded the duration of most known wartime lifeboat survivals. His physical condition was severely compromised, but he remained alive, conscious, and capable of basic tasks. The situation had narrowed to two outcomes: continued drift with diminishing capacity or external intervention. On April 5, 1943, after approximately 133 days adrift, the raft approached the northern coast of Brazil. Lim did not recognize the land by name, but he observed changes consistent with proximity to shore. The water color shifted. Bird activity increased. Floating vegetation became common. That day, Lim was sighted by local fishermen operating near the mouth of the Amazon River. The raft was in poor condition. Lim's physical state reflected prolonged exposure and malnutrition. He was unable to stand without assistance. The fishermen brought him aboard their vessel. There was no immediate medical intervention beyond basic care. Lim was transported to Belém, Brazil, where authorities documented his condition and circumstances. His weight had dropped significantly. He was dehydrated and sunburned, with infected sores and impaired vision. Medical staff confirmed that he had survived solely on emergency supplies, fish, rainwater, and improvised methods. There was no evidence of delirium or loss of consciousness during the latter part of his ordeal. Recovery was gradual. Lim's survival was later verified by British authorities. His account was consistent with drift patterns and known ocean currents. The raft itself was not preserved, but its description matched standard Carly float specifications. There was no formal celebration. Lim was repatriated and eventually returned to duty in a non-seagoing capacity. His survival was noted as exceptional but not sensationalized at the time. The event concluded without spectacle. Lim had entered the ocean alone and left it quietly, carried not by rescue technology but by proximity and chance. Poon Lim's survival became part of the official wartime record rather than a public narrative. In 1943, his case was reviewed by the British Admiralty, which recognized the duration and conditions of his ordeal as unprecedented among single-person lifeboat survivals in the Atlantic during the Second World War. His experience was used to reassess the design and provisioning of emergency life rafts. As a direct result of the review, Carley floats and other life rafts were modified to include improved fishing equipment, water collection tools, and survival manuals. These changes were applied broadly across Allied fleets, affecting sailors who would never know the origin of the revisions. Lim himself did not return to open ocean service. His health improved, though some physical effects of prolonged exposure remained. After the war, he sought to settle permanently in the United States. Despite his documented service and survival, immigration authorities initially denied his application, citing existing policies that restricted Chinese immigration. His case eventually succeeded, in part due to public attention surrounding his survival and support from advocacy groups. Lim lived quietly afterward. He worked in various occupations and avoided public attention. There is no extensive personal testimony from him beyond factual accounts provided to authorities and later historians. He did not publish a memoir. The significance of Lim's survival lies not in endurance alone, but in documentation. His case provides a rare, well-recorded example of long-duration survival at sea without rescue, propulsion, or navigation. It demonstrates the limits of the human body and the effectiveness of simple, repeatable systems under extreme constraint. The Atlantic carried Lim for 133 days and released him without comment. The ocean did not change because of his survival. Human systems did slightly in response. The record remains, not as a story of conquest, but as a measure of what was possible under conditions that offered no margin for error.